Okay, thank you everybody for joining. Sorry for the week delay. I had an oral surgery that I wish I didn't have to do, but Baruch Hashem, we are back. Um, Here we are. We just finished Kriyat Torah, and now we're continuing with Ashrei and U'Va Letzion. U'Va Letzion is known to all those people who have learned Gemara before, who know the fancy word for it. U'Va Letzion is known as Kiddusha D'Sidra. That's the fancy word for it that we get from the Gemara in Sotah. And that's going to be the main core of our discussion tonight. I want to discuss this Kiddusha D'Sidra. But before we do that, I have to be fair. And I really want to follow the Sidur. And the Sidur, after Kriyat Torah, has a Kaddish to separate. And then it has Ashrei. So we've discussed Ashrei Yoshe V'techa before. And there's not too much to add here. But I just want to recap very quickly what we know about this particular Ashrei that comes after Shmona Esrei, and or after Tachnun, and or after Kriyat Torah. And if you use the Siddur enough, you'll know what I'm talking about. So what is this Ashrei? So Ashrei in general, the history of Ashrei begins. The history of Ashrei begins as Tehillah LeDavid. Usually when the Gemara refers to Ashrei, it doesn't call it Ashrei. It calls it Tehillah LeDavid. When the Geonim speak of Ashrei, they don't call it Ashrei. They call it Tehillah LeDavid, and that's because they're referring to the Psalm Kuf Mem Hey. They're referring to the Perek Tehillim. And the words Ashrei, the introduction with the words Ashrei from the verses of other parts of Tehillim, were only prepended, meaning affixed to the beginning of Ashrei in medieval times. And it's likely that originally there was a much longer embellishment, and we have some evidence of this in a few Sidurim, of a much longer series of Pisukim that began with the words Ashrei, almost as like a song or a chant before the Pisukim of Tehillah LeDavid. Eventually, an abridged version of it was prepended, and that's what we know as Ashrei today. But luckily for us, we also have a teshuvah about this Ashrei in particular. And tonight, a lot of our material and a lot of our sources comes from the teshuvot of Rabbi Natronai Gaon. I'm holding in my hands here the volume from the Ofek Institute from Yerachmiel Brody, a giant scholar of the Gaonic era. And he put together this set of the Teshuvot HaGeonim. And Rabbi Natronai Gaon in Teshuvah Lamed Chet in Orach Chaim has a very, very important amount of information for us. Rabbi Natronai was the Gaon, the head of the yeshiva or the academy in the yeshiva of Sura, which is in modern-day Baghdad in the late 800s. And he is an incredibly important source of information for a lot of halacha and a lot of history of the tefillah. But this teshuva is the one that I want to concern us with right now. I wonder if I could share my screen because I do know, just for everyone to follow along, I do know that I have a picture of it. So let me just see if I can give everybody my screen. Yes, I can. Hold on. Let's do this together. I'm going to share my screen. And we'll look at Teshuva Lamed Ches together. It says as follows. It sounds like they asked him, they asked the rabbi a question regarding Yancha Hashem B'Yom Sarat. We don't have the entire question, but we have the answer. He says, when the Talmud says that a person who says Ashrei every day, or Tehillah LeDavid every day, more precisely, is going to have a share in the world to come, it doesn't say he has to say it 2 or 3 times a day. And the Talmud sounds like even one time. Well, this is a very important piece of information because the modern Vilna Shas says that a person should say Tehillah LeDavid 3 times a day to have a chelik in Olam Haba. But the Rosh Yeshiva of Bavel is telling you, no, that's not the Gerus on the Gemara. And frankly, he's a very believable source since, I mean, his job qualification is knowing Talmud Bavli Baal Peh backwards and forwards. Ella, what does he say? Chachamim ha'achronim, the later rabbis, Hitzkinu liYisrael shebayarot, they instituted for the Jews who lived in the cities, Lomar Shema yipashu bepamel b'shtayim. The rabbis of the cities considered it so important to have a share in the world to come that to say Ashrei in order to have a share with Kavana and therefore have a share of the world to come, that they put it in davening 3 times a day. Once in the beginning of Shachas, Pesukei de Zimra, another time after Shacharis, and then another time before Mincha. Viraya ledavar. Let's bring a proof. Da Shabbat in basidra b'Shachrit. Shabbat doesn't have a sidra on Shacharit. Ve'en batila le'vidal shtei pamim. Right? We only say it twice. It must be that they were so concerned that people should say it with kavana that they made us say it 3 times so that at least you'll have one. And then he gives us some more historical information. He says, "V'af b'kedusha desidra b'shtei yeshivot tila leDavid omrin." Both yeshivot, meaning Surah and Pumbedita, which used to be the yeshiva of Naharda, but Beit Rabbeinu Shebebavel, and in a smaller yeshiva called Beit Rabbeinu Shebebavel, Tila leDavid anu omrim. We say Ashrei every day. Some places say Tila leDavid, and some places say Yancha Hashem Yom Surah instead. He's saying that the minhag is in most of the yeshivot to say Ashrei and Yancha. Some places just say Yancha Hashem B'Yom Sarah. Extremely valuable to Shuvah of Rabbi Natronai Gaon. Now, it's really interesting. Two things are really interesting. Number one, as we'll see soon, he seems to be very familiar with the minhagim of the Beit Rabbeinu Shebebavel, this smaller yeshiva, which was the ancestral yeshiva of Rav from Bavel, when Rav came to Bavel in, I think, the year 224. And furthermore, he speaks about the Chachamim Achronim for the Jews of the cities. That's a very interesting expression, the Jews of the cities. And I just want to show you a map for a second to give you some idea of what he might mean. I mean, Natronai Gaon was the Jewish people in the time of Rabbi Natronai Gaon lived, the dominant, important Jewish communities lived in the area that we know of today as Iraq, but geographically, it could also be called northern Mesopotamia, and that's between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Here pictured is a couple of the major centers. You have Mechuza, Nahar Surah, but there's also smaller places like Pum Nahara, Harpanya, Difti, Mata Mechasya, Narash, Nahar Pikod, many other localities throughout this stretch between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. After the Arab conquest in the 600s, the late 500s, a lot of the smaller Jewish communities that didn't have so much ability to defend themselves, and they learned that from the Arab conquests, they began to urbanize, and they started to move here, as you see in the green on the top, towards Baghdad. And for various socioeconomical reasons, Baghdad also became a much more attractive city. Therefore, just like today, you'll have a Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn, you'll have a Panovich in Eretz Yisrael, you'll have, a Yeshiva of Brooklyn in Lakewood. You will a branch of Yeshiva of Brooklyn in Lakewood. In the same way, the Yeshivot of Surah and Pumbedita no longer, in the time of Natronai Gaon, were no longer in Surah and Pumbedita. They eventually had moved to Baghdad, and they were all in the same city. So what he is reflecting on is the earlier reality, much earlier than the 800s. He's saying that originally, when there were rabbis for every city, because the Jews in Babylonia were much more spread out, that's when all the rabbis did this, meaning he's making an educated guess. Natronai Gaon doesn't know for sure, but he's confident to make an educated guess that this came from the rabbis of the cities of Bavel before his time. That's a very important thing to note. So what we know about Ashrei is that it found its way to the end of Tefillah. We don't know exactly why, but Rav Natronai gives us an educated guess. Strangely, Rav Natronai Gaon is the one who tells us that we really shouldn't do Shavach after Tefillah because it's a Genai. It's inappropriate to say Shavach after Tefillah, meaning we shouldn't do Pesukei de Zimra after Shmona Esrei. So this would seem to be some sort of exception to his rule, but it's not entirely clear. Okay, now he doesn't speculate as to why we say Lamnatseach. We shall see shortly that the Hasidei Ashkenaz have their own theory. They speculate to the history of U'Va Letzion that U'Va Letzion was written as a reaction to a Shat Hashmad when we couldn't say Kedusha. And therefore, because it was from a Shat Hashmad when we couldn't say Kedusha, it was a time of persecution. Therefore, it was customary to say Lamnatseach Mizmor David Yancha Hashem B'Yom Tzara, because it was a time of persecution. That was their theory for why we say Lamnatseach, but Rabbi Natronai Gaon doesn't give a theory. He just mentions as a fact that it was a minhag to say Lamnatseach at the end. in our modern day life, we could retroject a little and say that it's very common after a learning period or after a prayer period to say a mizmar of Tehillim for people who are in distress. It happens today because since October 7th, many shuls still say a Shir Malot. So it's possible that this is a relic at the end of davening of just saying a Shir Hamalot, so to speak, of saying Alam Natseach for any Jews that are in distress. We just don't know for sure. If Sadia Gaon doesn't have Alam Natseach Yan Hashem Yom Tzara at all. Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar and Abu Durham says something very interesting. They say it's the 19th parak of Tehillim, and just like we just said Shmona Esrei, 18 brachot, so just like after we say 18 prakim of Tehillim, we have this 19th one. So too after the 18 brachos of Shmona Esrei, we should say this 19th psalm. The Abu Durham also points out that it has to do with Geula. There's one thing I'm searching for, and I'm almost embarrassed I couldn't find it. Perhaps I didn't look hard enough, but Professor Hoffman, Lawrence Hoffman, says that just like that in the beginning of davening, Matovu Alecha used to be a way of counting 10 people. I don't know where he knows this from, but basically Matovu has 10 words. Matovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkunecha Yisrael. Basically, he believes Matovu Alecha Yaakov was a way of counting 10 people to make sure he had a minyan at the beginning of davening. And he believes the Lam Naseach Mizmor David has 10 Pesukim, and therefore it's also a way of counting 10 people to make sure you had 10 people for Kedusha at the end of davening. Now, Professor Hoffman doesn't usually just say things. I was enormously surprised that he didn't cite his source for this. And I've never heard this. I've been around the block, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't find the source in time for this shir, but I did not see this. I don't know where this is from, and therefore, if anybody does find this information before I do, please let me know. Maybe my eyes missed it, but I don't know how this could be true. But that's what he says. So I'll pass on that information to you. Okay, let's move on to Kedusha de Sidra, which is the reason we came here. Now, Kedusha de Sidra is fundamentally a Kedusha. And there are three major Kedushot that we have. There's the Kedusha de Yotzer, right? The one we say by Kriya Shema, the Brachos of Kriya Shema. There's the Kedusha de Amidah, which is what we say during the Chazarat Hashatz. And then there is the Kedusha de Sidra, which is the Kedusha of this portion. This Kedusha is distinct from the Kedusha of the Amidah and the Kedusha de Yotzer. We learned last time, for example, that the Kedusha de Amidah is, we learned last time that the Kedusha de Amidah is most likely an organic outgrowth. We saw that Tosefta speaks about how Rabbi, I think Yehuda, used to respond when the Chazan would say Ata Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh, and he was, or whatever the Nusach was, Kadosh Ata V'Nara Shemecha. When the Chazan would repeat the Shmona Esrei, the Kahal would offer Pisukim that they would say alongside the Chazan. So it appears that what originally began as an organic response of the congregation became an official part of the liturgy. And what we learned last time is that although the Kedusha Amidah might have just grown organically and evolved by itself, the numinosity, meaning the spiritual gravity of Kedusha, gave it a life force of its own. And it's not to be underestimated. It is indeed possible that, of course, as we can see from much of the evidence, that it's not a takana of Rabbi Gamliel B'Yav. That it's not that early, because if it was, the Gemara would mention so many things about Kedusha de Amidah and Kedusha de Yotzer. It would be discussed by Mishnah and Gemara and Braitot. But because it's really not, it's not likely that Kedusha de Amidah and Kedusha de Yotzer are originally like Yavnian from Yavne. It's much more likely that they evolved naturally from the Chazarat Hashatz. But their numinous nature, the fact that they have such a spiritual weight to them and that people feel so connected to the divine when they say them, gave them their own very particular form of evolution and a very important way that people consider it a davar shebekdusha, which has an enormous amount of gravity. Kedusha de Sidra, however, doesn't have those characteristics. It is never seen as having the same gravity. Many poskim say that you could say it alone, you don't need 10 people. It's not a davar shebekdusha. Again, it's a machloket, but many poskim see it that way. And it doesn't have that same a character. Some even call it kedusha de yeshiva, the kedusha which you sit by. However, despite halacha not granting kedusha de sidra the same weight as kedusha d'amida, and despite not having all those characteristics, kedusha de sidra is still the luckiest kedusha because it's mentioned by the Gemara. Kedusha d'amida is never explicitly referred to by the Gemara and Bavli. It's possibly spoken to about. It's possibly referenced in the Gemara and Bavli. It's possibly referenced, most probably referenced in the Gemara and Yerushalmi. But Kedusha de Sidra is explicitly mentioned in the Gemara in Bavli. Let's learn the Gemara together. It's Gemara and Sotah Daf Memtet Amud Aleph. Amer Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. From the day the temple was destroyed, there is no day in which there is no curse upon the earth. Amar Rava expounds upon this Mishnah in Sotah. He says, B'chol yom v'yom, every day merubah klalato mishel chavero. Every single day the curses on this earth become worse. Shene'amar, as the pasuk says, Baboker tomar miyatein erev. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. Uba'erev tomar miyatein boker, and by the evening you shall say, if only it were still morning. Hi boker, ilay ma boker de lamachar miyada may have ela de chalif. Right, so the Gemara says, well, how do you know which boker it's talking about? It must be the previous boker, because otherwise, why would you hope for the future if you don't know what the future might hold? Ella, if that's true, that the world has more curses every day and you're constantly wishing things were better the way they used to be, alma maikai, ella alma amai kamikayem. What is the world standing on? How is it possible that the world still exists? The entropy should have completely destroyed us a long time ago. The Gemara answers, Akedusha desidra v'ayehe shmei rabba de'agadita. The zechut, the merit of Kedusha desidra, and the merit of Yehe Shmei Rabba Da'agadita are what sustain the world. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Shene'amar, as the pasuk says, Eretz afeta kamo ofel v'tzalmavet v'los darim. The world was darkened, was made nebulous like dark, and the shadow of death with chaos without order. Says the Gemara, Hayesh sidarim. If there were sidarim, which sounds like which is like a drush. If there were study periods, right, not order, but study periods, Tofia Me'ofal should appear out of the darkness. Sounds like the Gemara is putting a tremendous amount of weight in this tefillah called Kedusha de Sidra. Now, what exactly Kedusha de Sidra means in this Gemara, we don't actually know for sure. We do know that by the time of the Geonim, Kedusha de Sidra, as we recognize it today, was fully formulated. But that's 500 years later. How do we know what the Gemara was talking about by Kedusha, the Kedusha de Sidra? So let's see what Rashi says. Rashi here says, let me see if I can. Kedusha de Sidra, Seder Kedusha, Shelo Tiknua Elishu Kol Yisrael Oskima Torah B'chol Yom Davar Muat, Sheomer Kriyato V'Targumo. Rashi explains that Kedusha de Sidra, the Kedusha of the Sidra, doesn't mean that it's a Kedusha of the learning period. The opposite, says Rashi, and the Rambam learns this way also. It means Seder Kedusha, the order of the Kedusha prayer. Why? Why do we say this whole Kedusha prayer? Because we want to say those two Pesukim from Yeshayahu, U'Va Letzion Goel Shaveh Peshe B'Yakov. We want to say a few Pesukim of Navi and translate it so that it should be like a small learning of Torah every day. Because everybody, whether they're Talmidei Chachamim, whether they're lay people, and because everybody, every single Jew is going to say a little bit of prayer and a little bit of tefillah, and he's going to praise Hashem at the end, therefore it's very dear to Shemayim. Also, the Amen Yeshmei Rabba Mevarach that you say after learning Torah, Achar HaGadashar Darshan Doresh Barabim, B'chol Shabbat, Hayon Noagin Kach, V'sham Hayu Nakpatzin Kol Ha'am L'Shmo L'fi She'enu Yom Shel Melacha V'yesh Kan Torah V'Kiddush Hashem. Essentially, saying a Kedusha or a Kaddish after learning is a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, and for that the world stands. Now, although the Rishonim like Rashi and the Rambam and the Chassidei Ashkenaz and the Rokeach all have their theories as to what the Kedusha de Sidra is and how it developed, Rabbi Natronai Gaon is a much earlier source, at least 200 or 300 years earlier, and he had much better historical information. Rashi seems to be on the right track, that it is the value here is the learning of Torah mixed with the praise of Hashem. But for the history here, we should probably defer to Rav Natronai Gaon because he probably is earlier and has a better source of the history. And Rav Natronai Gaon, as luck would have it, also has a teshuvah on the history of Kedusha de Sidra. And he learns the opposite of Rashi. Not that it is a Seder Kedusha, rather that it is Kedusha de Sidra, the Kedusha of the study Seder. And he says as follows. Rabbi Natronai Gaon says that there was a minhag in Bavel, an old minhag. The minhag was, he says, Kach minhag rishonim. This is the minhag of the earlier generations. A place which had Talmidei Chachamim, kishayu mitvalim and oflim apneim ukadshim. This is very strange language, so I won't go into all of it. But he says, after davening, when they would do Kaddish, after they finished Amenei Shmei Rabbah, they would bring out a Navi. It's not Haftarah. It's not like the reading of Haftarah, but they would take out a Navi and they would read 10 Pesukim. At the end of every davening, they would say 10 Pesukim. Hein Chaser, Hein Yater, roughly 10 Pesukim. The early minhag in Bavel was, much earlier than me, was that after davening, they would always read a little bit of Navi, and they would be mitargemet, and they would translate it. The and afterwards they would say Vikar Zel Zevi Amar, and they would translate. They would say Kadosh Kadosh Kadosh, and they would translate that too, because those are also Pesukim from Navi, just like they translated the words from Navi. And then they would say V'Tiseinu Ruach, and they would also say Baruch Hashem Mikamo. After that, after the Navi period, and the Seder Kedusha, the Kedusha de Sidra, they would also have another learning period at the end where they would learn Gemara, Mishnah, Torah, etc. Only after that would people go to work. However, because times got tough and people couldn't stay in shul so long, what happened was that they did away with this minhag. And because there's no longer a minhag to do Navi, people still wanted to do this last part, U'Va Letzion Goel Shavei Peshem Yaakov, and say V'Kar Zal Zev Amar Kadosh Kadosh Kadosh. And therefore it stuck, even though the study periods fell away, this minhag stuck. Most scholars defer to Rav Natronai Gaon because this seems to be the most rational, and the most, not much just the most rational, but the most, this is the explanation that basically makes the most sense and ticks the most boxes, especially because of the Targum. Why would we have to be mitargem kadosh kadosh kadosh? It makes no sense. It's not a standard part of liturgy that we are mitargem pesukim that are from Nach. It must be that because they were mitargem everything beforehand, they're also being mitargem these pesukim. That's the general gist that most people go with. Interestingly, he also brings the minhag of Beit Rabbeinu Sheba Bavel that they would have a first seder every day. And the yeshiva on first seder was 4 hours long, and only at the end of first seder would they do Lam Natzeach Mizmor Yan Chashim Yom Tzara, and then they would do U'Va Letzion. Okay. What does this mean for us? This means that originally, first of all, Kedusha de Sidra means a Kedusha that they would do at the end of the learning period, Sidra. Sidra is really the learning period. Second of all, why did they choose just the Kedusha part to do? And they didn't continue to do even some of the other Navi Pesukim. So Rabbi Natronai Gaon adds that, well, it seemed appropriate to do 3 Kedushot every day, since we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh 3 times. Maybe we should say the Kedusha 3 times as well every single day. Lastly, give me 1 second. What this would mean, after we look at the Gemara and Sotah, and after we look at the Siddur of Sadia, the Tshuva of Natronai Gaon, is that this very neatly falls into a category of prayer called a nechamata. And essentially what's happening here is that this is not a liturgy of the synagogue. U'Va Letzion is not a liturgy which developed from the synagogue. It is a liturgy which developed for and from the study hall, for and from the study periods. And a nechamata is a very peculiar kind of prayer. For example, a good example of a nechamata would be Kaddish. In Kaddish, we say itself, Le'ela min kol bechatat shirata tishpachata v'nechamata. A nechamata is a type of prayer which is called in English a messianic doxology. Medieval and ancient Bavel, they had a prayer called an Echamata, which is essentially a praise of God, which speaks about the hope for the Goel, for the future messianic era. Sometimes it's called a consolatory peroration, if you wanted to be fancy and academic about it. Essentially, at the end of the learning period, there's a minhag to a custom to mention Mashiach and to mention a hope for Mashiach and a prayer for Mashiach. This developed into the Kaddish that we know it today, and it also developed into a few other prayers like Ala Kol Yitkadal, and similarly into U'Va Letzion and Baruch Eloheinu Shebaranu L'Chvodo. These are some of the prayers that were used as messianic doxologies, and clearly U'Va Letzion is one of those, as we could see from the Gemara and as we could see from the Tshuva of Rav Natronai Gaon. Now, there are two more teshuvot of the Gaonim brought in the Sefer HaItim, and I think they're actually really interesting. In one of them, he says that in his time, any place which had Talmidei Chachamim, this is in page 281 of the Berlin edition of Sefer HaItim, he says in many places which have Talmidei Chachamim, every single Shabbat after Shacharit, they wouldn't leave shul right away. They would first do Kaddish. They would first do a learning session. Then they would do Kedusha Da'agadata, meaning they would do a Kaddish D'Rabanan at the end. And some places even do U'Va Letzion on Shabbat. They'll do U'Va Letzion Goel, and they'll do Kedusha D'Sidra on Shabbat. Another thing that the Sefer HaItim brings is that in some places on Shabbat by Mincha, this is on page 289 in the Sefer HaItim, he says in some places, he brings this from one of the Gaonim. You know what? I'll actually show it on the page because I think it's valuable to see. They actually did this whole thing about reading Navi on Shabbat Mincha, and that is why on Shabbat Mincha we also say U'Va Letzion. Look here. He says somebody asked Rav Natronai like this: La'achar Mincha b'Shabbat shonin avot v'korim b'Torah v'hay depaski sidra b'ktuvim b'narda lo chazilan haidano mandaragili me'avad hachi. Meaning, here in my yeshiva in Naharda, we do no longer have. I no longer saw this minhag of doing kituvim before mincha. However, in one of the old records here we have in the yeshiva from one of the Gaonim, Hazilan diragili haidano lemifsak. We saw another a text which says as follows: a long time ago, the Yeshivot Mavel, they had a minhag lemifsak sidra b'ktuvi v'zeu ma katav gaon sidura de mincha b'shavta kari b'sidra v'navi mai denichalu v'kad mesayim ikai shlucha de sibura v'amrsu kesof sidra v'anu batrei hai pisuka v'adavata kadosh yishev tilot Yisrael. The language here is a little difficult, but what he's saying essentially is that by mincha time they would learn Navi, whatever they wanted to out of Navi. And then at the end, at the end of learning the Pisukim of Navi, the Shliach Tzibor would end with the Pisukim of Navi, and then he would say V'ata Kadosh Yeshivot. He would repeat the last Pisukim of Navi that they learned, and then they would say V'ata Kadosh Yeshiv Tilot V'Karazel Zebi Amar. In other words, this was also a nechamata said at the end of a study period. Now, we have a few minutes left. Let's recap some of the academic discussion around this. I hope we don't run out of time. So first of all, let's talk about the Roshei Medabrim. Right, the Roshei Medabrim in Tefillah is, of course, Ismael Bogan. He, from an academic perspective, believes that Kedusha D'Sidra is the oldest of all three Kedushot. Now, the research and literature around Kedusha is incredibly thorny, incredibly complicated, and it's a very advanced topic of liturgical studies. But to leave all that aside, he believes Kedusha D'Amidah developed later, and Kedusha D'Yotzer the latest. For some odd reason, though, he believes Kedusha D'Sidra is the oldest. He doesn't cite his sources. He doesn't give a reason, but he believes it's a Babylonian creation, which was done in Bavel, and it was done later than, the earliest of all the other Kedushot. And I really don't understand why he says this. But however, if he's correct that it's the earliest of all the Kedushot, then it would be from like the 1st century, maybe even earlier. So if that's true, then why doesn't the Gemara ever speak about it like much more? Why doesn't the Mishnah speak about it much more? And again, every scholar who has an opinion about how the Kedushot developed will find a way to explain away Kedusha de Sidra. Everybody has their own system. Yosef Heinemann, I would say probably, let's start with Fleischer. Fleischer here, pictured here, Ezra Fleischer, is probably the most remarkable in his position. I would say just because he stands so alone in his position. His position is that the Gemara is completely misinterpreted. When the Gemara says Kedusha de Sidra, it doesn't mean Kedusha de Sidra as we know it today and it's from the time of the Geonim. Rather, Kedusha de Sidra is just another way of saying Kaddish. That's what it means. Kedusha de Sidra is Yehei Shmei Rabba de Agadata. It's the same thing. Sometimes in the works of the Geonim, we say we see Kaddish referred to as Kedusha. So he believes Kedusha de Sidra is the same thing as Kedusha de Agadata. So what's going on here? He believes that much later in Bavel, they put in Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh into U'Va Letzion, just in case anybody missed Kedusha de Amidah. Essentially, U'Va Letzion was always a part of the end of davening, right? U'Va Letzion, Baruch Elokeinu, those were the way that they ended, let's say, Kriyat Torah by davening. But over time, because they were so concerned about saying U'Va Letzion, they were so concerned about saying Kedusha every day, as they were in Bavel, therefore, they put it at the end in case somebody missed both Kedusha de Yotzer and Kedusha de Amidah. Wow. And he also says that one of the reasons they added it was because they misread the Gemara. They thought the Gemara meant Kedusha de Sidra was what's it called? U'Va Letzion, and therefore they thought it was important, and that's why the minhag stuck. And yet still, even though they tried to make it a Kedusha, the poskim still argued. Oh, one other thing he says is, well, they were mitargemet. They put in a targum to show that it's not really a real kedusha. And he says, still, it didn't work. People still thought it was a real kedusha. So it's very hard for me to believe this position because this, in my opinion, the more far-fetched of all the scholars. He has a very sophisticated opinion of the history of kedusha. He believes that it goes all the way back to Gamliel B'Yavneh. It's a very difficult position to support with today's evidence, but it's a very forceful position. So a lot of people are very afraid to argue with it. Most helpfully, in my opinion, even though he's an outlier, the most helpful part is that he proves that in Eretz Yisrael, they never said U'Va Letzion. That was not the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. The Nusach Yerushalmi didn't include U'Va Letzion and Kedusha de Sidra as we know it. So that's a very helpful point for the history of understanding U'Va Letzion, and I think there's much to build on that. But more scholars are going to have to work on this. Lastly, Yosef Heinemann and Leon Liebreich. Liebreich wrote a very important piece on Kedusha de Sidra and U'Va Letzion, but he spends most of the article talking about Baruch Elokeinu shebaranu lechvodo, because to him that's the more interesting part. In his view, Baruch Elokeinu shebaranu lechvodo was a completely independent prayer, and it seems to be that that's the case. It seems that Hashem Elokei Avraham, Shuv Mechron Apecha v'Enachem al Hara Lamecha, like that end part, Hashem Elokei Yisrael. I think that's the end of U'Va Letzion. That part is a part of Old Tachanunim. Baruch Elokeinu was a pseudo Birkat Torah, and they were completely independent of U'Va Letzion. They only got added later, and we find a few places in the Siddur of Sadia and a few places in the Geniza where Baruch Elokeinu shebaranu lechvodo are said completely independently of U'Va Letzion. They're just said after learning, like if a Yachid is learning, or if a Yachid can't say U'Va Letzion. And in a few other places, Baruch Elokeinu was recited because it was at the end of a study period. And he believes Baruch Elokeinu was appended to U'Va Letzion much later, and that's the part that interests him the most. He compares it very convincingly to many versions of Birkat Torah, and he thinks that it was an early form of Birkat Torah. And Yosef Heinemann is very characteristic. I mean, he says he develops his idea of the tefillot of the study hall, so to speak, the tefillot of the Beit Midrash. He has the form critical method of understanding tefillah, and this is the form of tefillah which developed out of the study halls. And of course, there were different study halls that had their own minhag. But he makes one edit on Liebreich, which is important. Liebreich wants to say that originally Baruch Elokeinu shebaranu lechvodo was a Birkat Torah, which started with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Once they realized that that wasn't halachic, they cut it down and they just said Baruch Elokeinu, because halacha only says you have to say Baruch Torah in the morning privately, and you have to say Birchas HaTorah when you read from the Torah in public. They realized that, wait a second, we can't say another Birchas HaTorah at the end of a public learning session because there's no halachic grounding for that. So they stopped doing it. That's his opinion. Heinemann says, what? Why? Why do you have to say that? It could be very well be that there was a third form of Birkat Torah. The first two forms were the form of Birkat Torah that you do in the morning, the form of Birkat Torah that you do privately, the form of Birkat Torah that we do before and after Kriyat Torah, and thirdly, there was another type of Birkat Torah that everyone understood that didn't begin with Shemu Malchut, and that was something like Baruch Elokeinu Shebaranu L'Chvado, or the Hiratzon Mefanecha that we say Shenishmar Chukecha that we say at the in middle of Baruch Elokeinu. There were other bracha forms, bracha-like forms that developed after saying after a learning period, just like the Nechamata in general, the entire messianic doxology genre developed. So too did a pseudo Birkat Torah develop, which ended the study period. Now, if you go the full 9 yards and you say that Baruch Elokeinu is just an appendix to Kriyat Torah, then you're also kind of saying that Baruch Elokeinu, or possibly even U'Va Letzion, used to only be said on Mondays and Thursdays. Like if the entire sidra here that we're concerned with is not the study period after davening, but rather the Kriyat Torah itself, and that's why we're doing all this jazz, the U'Va Letzion and the Baruch Elokeinu, then it's just a completely different structure. It is very likely that he's right in the sense that these are different components, that U'Va Letzion with its Targum and its and Hashem Elokei Yisrael and Baruch Elokeinu are completely separate, and they only got combined much later. But a lot of the data he works with in that article, and I encourage you to see it if you have time, a lot of the data he works with is flawed. He misdates a couple of things, but it's again very important work that I believe everybody should see. Lastly, I'll give you some food for thought. I was wondering if perhaps it's possible, and this is again completely my own conjecture, take it for what it's worth. I was wondering if part of the reason why they did a Targum for Kedusha might have been related, might have been related to an anti-Christian sentiment. And if you listen to this podcast and you know quite a bit about liturgy, I think you would appreciate this idea because it is interesting. What if this is entirely anti-Christian? You realize U'Va Letzion Goel is the Pesukim in Yeshaya, right? And Yeshaya famously in Perek Samach Aleph has the Pesukim which the Christians believe to be speaking about Yeshu rather than about a non-specific Mashiach. These Pesukim, U'Va Letzion Goel, right, speak about the Mashiach specifically. How are you supposed to differentiate a shul from a Jewish shul from a Christian shul in ancient times when they daven so similarly? And if at the end of davening they're going to say the Pesukim out loud of U'Va Letzion Goel, how do you know it's not a Christian shul, right? A lot of Christian shuls were mostly Jews. What if it's possible that the reason they were translating Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is an anti-Trinity purpose? Because many of the Christians and the early Christians understood the Pesukim of Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh to be a reference in the Bible for the Trinity. What if it's possible that the shuls deliberately translated Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh with the Targum to show the authoritative version and to say that no, this is not talking about 3 levels of the Godhead. This is talking about Kaddish al Maya, Kaddish. This is going to be according to our translation, not according to the Christian translation. I thought that was an interesting idea that I had this week, and I can't let go of the idea. So I'm going to speak it here so that I never forget that I had this idea. And God willing, in the future, I'll be able to prove if it is or isn't true. So thank you for your time and attention. They're starting our Vit now. And we will continue Bezrat Hashem next week.